the most powerful force in the universe is compound interest. That's a bold claim attributed to Albert Einstein, who certainly knew a thing or two about powerful forces. Why is compound interest so important? Because small investments sustained over time lead to exponential outcomes. What starts with 1 becomes 2, then 4, then 8, and eventually millions or even billions. And the same principle is also true with compounding actions. Small actions, when repeated consistently, lead to dramatic, life-altering changes. This is true for everyone, but it's particularly true if you're feeling stuck, paralyzed by options and unsure of what to do next. The critical step is to take one small step, day after day, and repeat it as a tiny habit. So in this episode of The Space Makers, we're going to talk about the importance of action and how to act your way to new forms of thinking. We'll also share a snippet from an interview with TV host Osher Gunsberg, previously known as Andrew G, who transformed his life by making a simple decision to walk to the postbox each day, getting off the couch, and launching his career. Are you ready to experience the compounding benefits of small habits? Let's dive in. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Space Makers podcast season 3, where we are exploring how to get unstuck if you feel stuck in a domain of life and want to move forward. And I'm here with the co-host with the most, the best of the rest, the one and only Matt Payne.
With the best of the rest.
The best of the rest.
Yeah,
how you doing,
thanks.
Matt?
Yeah, no, good. For a leftover, feeling pretty good. Yeah.
Excellent. You're the best leftover there is. Yeah. But no, it's so good to have you. We are going to talk about action and the importance of actually launching into action. And in particular, we're going to talk about tiny habits and the importance of small, consistent actions to get large benefits, particularly when you feel stuck.
Yeah, that's great. Small things over a long time.
Let me start with a story, and it's a fable that I heard years ago, and I love it because it speaks about the power of small and the power of doing things consistently. So this is a famous legend or fable about a king, a chessboard, and a grain of rice. So once upon a time, there was, I feel like a story time.
Yeah, that was a great setup. That was a great setup.
So once upon a time, there was a king in India, and he loved to play chess. And one day there was a traveling craftsman who came to the king with an ornate chessboard with all the, most amazing materials from across the Near East. And the king wanted the chessboard and said, well, how much is this chessboard? How much will it cost me? And the craftsman, being, a little bit of a swindler, said, Oh, majestic king, I don't want gold, I don't want rubies or jewels for this kind of ornate, incredible, one-of-a-kind chessboard. All I want is a little bit of rice. And the king clearly was a bit skeptical and said, well, how much rice? And so the craftsman said, well, what I'd like you to do is get 1 grain of rice and put it on the first square of the chessboard, and then double it. So there's 2 on the second, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, 32, etc., until you get to all 64 squares of the chessboard. And that's all I want. That's all I want for the cost of this beautiful chess set. And so the king, not being so good at maths, thought, that sounds like a bit of rice, but it should be reasonable. And he ordered the keeper of the granary to go get the amount of rice and to purchase this board. Well, when the keeper of the granary did the maths, it soon became apparent that the king had been swindled, because by the time you got to the 21st square, the king owed 1 million grains of rice. By the time we got to the 41st square, it was over 1 trillion grains of rice. And by the 64th square, it equaled over 274 billion tons of rice. For context, that's enough rice to cover the entire landmass of India by 15 meters high. Or if those pieces of rice were kind of put end on end, it would be enough to go past the sun, out of our galaxy, all the way to Alpha Centauri and back 3 times.
Wow.
An expensive chessboard. But I love that story because it just shows how mind-boggling multiplication can be and the power of doubling something small for a consistent period of time. Albert Einstein once said that the most powerful force in the universe is compound interest. Albert Einstein, he had very quotable quotes. But it is pretty amazing. You look at a few grains of rice and it doesn't seem like much, but if you keep doing the small, consistent things and multiplying something again and again and again, well, with time, whether it be money or whether it be communities or whether it be habits, you get this exponential transforming effect. So I think it is true that one of the most powerful forces in the universe is compound interest, and yet we don't apply it enough to our lives. And so we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the power of multiplication, but also we're going to talk about it with regards to small habit change.
I reckon, for what it's worth, Warren Buffett will probably agree with you, and that's, it's probably not a bad guy to have in your corner.
It's not. In fact, from what I understand of Warren Buffett, he made the majority of his wealth in the last 5-10 years of his life. And the secret to Warren Buffett's wealth, from what I've read, is that he started investing earlier than others. And so it's a time game, not just a skill game. So again, that's the compounding interest.
So while we're talking of gurus, first Warren, I guess you had Einstein. Well, actually, to be fair, like this nameless...
We started with you first, and then Einstein, and then Warren Buffett.
Well, technically, we started with this wandering craftsman, who's also / swindler. So started with him, moved on to Einstein, then on to Buffett, and now James Clear. He's popularised so many good ideas, and I think it'd be fair to say he popularised this idea of, again, call it the effect of compounding or the effect of multiplication versus like mere addition.
So he calls them atomic habits, tiny habits that add up, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so all of them, all those habits had that principle running through it of compounding or multiplication. The way that he sums it up beautifully, I think, at least has stuck with me, is that to get twice as good as something, you don't have to be you don't have to put in like twice the effort, so to speak. It's more about those small, relatively like long-term incremental changes that build on each other. So it's not just pure addition, but multiplication. So only like a little bit more effort on top of what you've already done could lead to at least twice the total effect or outcome. Yeah.
And that's hugely encouraging, I think, if you feel stuck. And if you're in an area of life, whether it be finances or relationship or a career that you're kind of apathetic in, or in any area of your life, if you feel stuck and you need to find a way to move forward, well then I think it's super encouraging. You can get huge benefits, not by putting a huge amount of effort in, but by making a 1% improvement again and again and again. It's not necessarily a doubling like compound interest, but James Clear says if you can put a 1% change and then a 1% change and a 1% change and just keep on going, well, then it doesn't take long until, let's say, you get more energy. And when you have more energy, you have more strength. If you have more strength, then you have more motivation, at least in the health realm. And then you have more strength, and therefore you have more energy again. Do you know what I mean? So you get this compounding effect by doing a small amount on a regular basis. And I think that's encouraging whenever we're stuck. So, Matt, in today's episode, we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the power of small habits. We're going to talk about how to actuate new forms of thinking. And we're going to have a small snippet of an interview from Osher Gunsberg.
Osher Gunsberg, also formerly known as Andrew G. Is that right?
Andrew G. It's a little snippet I've been given permission to replay from 2MI, the podcast, as a great example of how someone felt stuck in their life. They were struggling with obesity, they were struggling with depression, and how a tiny, tiny habit change, really led to them becoming a healthier person who could then launch a career.
Yeah.
And of course, if you stick to the end of the episode, as usual, we'll give you a very practical application for how to make changes in your own life by compounding small habits. Okay, so Matt, let's go back to the SHIFT framework. And now we're up to episode 7 of season 3. So hopefully you'll know the SHIFT framework, which is what we're working through. But give us a quick recap of SHIFT and how it helps with getting unstuck.
Okay, here we go. S is for select a domain. So I've asked people just to pick one area in life where they feel stuck and work on that. Then we've got H for harness your strengths. Okay, so we did lots of work about just identifying strengths as opposed to targeting weaknesses. Then we had I for imagine new pathways. So don't get stuck in one rut of how do I fix or get unstuck, but broaden out a little bit. And then we got F, which is forge ahead with action. So we'll be spending this episode and the next looking at that. So again, we've spent enough time reflecting. Now we're going to actually get into the action. And then after that, the last one, T for travel alongside others.
Great. So what did we do last week? Activity.
Yeah. So that was the I for the imagine different pathways. So we asked people to take the area, the specific, I suppose, domain or example of where you feel stuck. And we asked them to spend 15 minutes, so turn the clock on, 15 minutes to brainstorm 25 different ways of getting unstuck. And critically, you weren't committing to any of these examples, any of the 25. And also critically, that could be as left field, zany, wild, wacky, choose your adjective as possible. It doesn't matter. So you're just like spitballing, right?
And part of the idea of having 25 is a lot, right?
Yeah.
It takes
Yeah.
a bit of imagination, and
Yeah.
so therefore it forces you to think of new options, and
Yeah.
that's part of what leads you to the next bit, which is to
Yeah.
choose an action, which we're going to talk about
Yeah,
today.
yeah. And to your point, I think last episode, again, like 25 sounds like a lot, but I guess the theory goes, if you just like have 25, then there's bound to be a couple of great ones in there. So a lot of it just could be, relatively, well, it was, fun and interesting, but it's not going to take. But one or two probably will.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're both struggling with different areas of stuckness in this season. You're struggling with, I suppose, time management, but particularly commitment.
Overcommitment.
Overcommitments.
Yeah.
And letting people down. And I've been struggling with some of my inner life, religious spirituality stuff. Very different domains.
Yeah.
But did you give it a go?
Yes, I did. And look, it felt odd to me because I'm not the guy who kind of just like brainstorms like that very often at all. But it helped having the parameters. So I literally like set the timer for 15 minutes and just had like the blank page in front of me and went for it. And I think I got, and we'll talk about it later, I guess. But I think I got at least one or two good keepers, and one that I'm particularly kind of taken with.
Okay, so one you're going to go with.
I think so.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Any wacky ones?
Yeah, so I think we talked about we mentioned in the last episode the possibility of feigning my own death and starting again, waking up in some Southern American country, with a new passport. But so that was like probably still apex. And then it kind of worked its way down.
Okay, so starting from death. And then
starting
going
from feigning your own death. Yeah. And then
Excellent.
you can take some degrees of that. Yeah, do I pretend I'm sick or something like that? Like, you know what I mean?
If you don't turn up to the next podcast episode, I know it's part of your plan. No, that sounds good. So look, I did it as well. I found it really helpful. As I've mentioned, I'm struggling with kind of knowing how to express my beliefs, my faith in this new season, kind of the rest of the inner life. And it was just actually really helpful to write a whole lot of random ideas about what I could do, knowing that a lot of what I am doing doesn't seem to feel like it used to. And I actually came up with some great options. One of them actually was to get a coach, like a spiritual director. I felt like I've needed some coaching and support. Now, it's been a few weeks since you and I caught up since the last podcast. So I've had 2 sessions already. Just great Nigerian pastor in America. She's like a great listener. And we've been able to talk through some of the tough stuff. I also had on my list that I should catch up with someone in Melbourne who I really respect, who has kind of given me some good guidance and wisdom in the past. And I had dinner with her and her husband. She recommended a book, and that book's been super helpful. So again, I feel like I've taken a few steps from that random array of 25 items.
I think you've jumped ahead. But
I have jumped ahead.
You've jumped ahead. Yeah,
that's what I do. But it's been good. I've appreciated it. But I wouldn't have thought of all those options had I not. I mean, it was brewing in the back of my mind to get a coach.
I mean, you may have a hunch or an inkling that this is going to be the option for you, but to some degree, there's a lot to be said for saying, well, I'm going to spend the time trying to just see if there's any alternatives. And you came up with at least 23 that weren't as good.
I was going to start a cult. I was going to leave my religion. So, put against all those ones, then, getting a coach was simple.
Yeah. Good. Glad that was affirmed. Yeah.
So, Matt, we have a new sponsor.
Yeah, and I am just thoroughly excited to say it's Blunstone.
Blunstone is a Tassie-based company, but they sell globally. They've been making hardworking boots for 150 years. And looking down, I can see you're wearing Blunstones right now.
I am. Yeah.
Was that set up?
No, it's complete nice bit of providence. Yeah, so I'm I've had these probably for literally 5 or 6 years now. Never polished them once, never looked after them once, never cleaned them once, and look how good they're looking, which is a testimony to the power of Blunstone.
Yeah.
Hard-working, hard-wearing, but whatever phase, whatever level of disdain and neglect you give them, they still come up looking fantastic, which is great.
Blunstone, you can neglect them and they still look good.
Yeah,
No, seriously,
I haven't got very much in my life like that.
Like you, I've got a great pair of Blunstone. I use them for gardening, for chainsawing. They're super hard wearing, but you can also wear them out. So we really appreciate Blunstone being a new sponsor of this podcast.
Yeah.
Blunstone building the future, but also building our podcast. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's the one time in life that people say, I look good when I put my foot in it.
Matt, you have lots of experience in the area of helping people change, particularly change their thinking, change their actions, having been a social worker and worked in a whole lot of areas of kind of counselling and group therapy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I trained as a social worker in the early 2000s, worked out I think I did about 15 or 16 years in the field, and that involved a lot of one-on-one stuff, but it also involved a heap of group, effectively like long-term, pretty intensive group therapy.
And you worked with some pretty kind of challenging, clients, I suppose you'd say?
Yeah, so I worked in a custodial setting. So I worked with inmates back in the day. Also worked with people who were struggling with alcohol and other drug issues as well. So basically addictions.
Yeah, so while we're talking about kind of vanilla, run-of-the-mill, stuckness issues, not full-blown addictions, chemical or otherwise, you've really worked with people in a whole lot of different areas. So I don't know, I think you've got some stuff to speak to in terms of knowing how to help people reframe their thinking and their behaviours.
Yeah, having said that, I don't want to downplay the seriousness of people who are deluded into thinking they can start their own cult. But but I guess I've got history with people, working with people who had some pretty significant behaviours as well as attitudes and thinking patterns that they needed to change, both for their own good but also the people around them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So look, we're talking about the importance of forging your way to new action and really the centrality of action, why action matters if you're stuck, and how to make action happen. Yeah, what are your thoughts from your background?
Yeah, so just to kind of frame this up properly and qualify it, again, I'm a former social worker, so like a fair bit of experience, but I haven't practiced in a while. When I was coming up, the main, if you like, therapeutic approach that I was trained in, very popular at the time, rigorous, validated by research, still very popular. So one of the mainstays when it comes to, tools in the toolkit of a counsellor or a social worker was CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy. And the idea, as I understand it, the kind of big idea behind that is that people's behaviour can change. So it's malleable in that regard, yeah? And they would argue that the end behaviour is always influenced by both feelings, so your emotional life, what's going on with you subjectively, first person, but also your thinking, so specific thoughts and thinking patterns. So the kind of the regular pathway, if you like, is thoughts lead and influence feelings, which in turn, combined with the thoughts, lead and influence behaviour or actions.
That makes sense.
Yeah, now it's really critical to say that that's in its most kind of simplistic form. Of course, it's actually more of a cycle. So, how I behave and act in the world and the feedback that I get is going to in turn influence and mould my thinking.
Yeah, all models are limited, but at least the idea that your thoughts influence your behaviours and your feelings.
And your feelings,
I don't think many people disagree with that.
That's how we find most of our lived experience. Yeah, that was good. It was effective. A lot of the time, again, it's got so much research behind it to back up its efficacy. But I think it'd be fair to say, in more recent times, other models have also come onto the scene to kind of complement that. And I think one that's really useful for our purposes when it talks about, again, not serious behaviours that need changing, but it's more like everyday life stuff, whether it's being overcommitted or, again, your particular issue.
I have many.
Is this approach called ACT. And ACT stands for Acceptance Commitment Therapy. Okay. And what I really like about this, and where I think it's really relevant for us, is that ACT says, look, maybe we as humans have overestimated how much control we actually have and can have over particularly our thoughts and our feelings. So if you go back to that, that Holy Trinity, thoughts, feelings, and behaviour, proponents of ACT would say, listen, at the end of the day, the thing that you've got most control over is actually what you do. What you do. Not so much what you think and what you feel, but what you do. And they'd go as far as to say, to some degree, our thoughts particularly are malleable, so we can influence them, we can work on our thinking. They'd also say, just trying to change your thinking and your feelings can take so much energy. So much energy. That energy is kind of, you've only got so much of it, right? So if you're directing it towards trying to change and manage my thoughts and my feelings, it's taking away from what I've got left over from my actual behaviour and my actions.
Yeah, okay. So maybe you can actually focus on changing your behaviours.
Yeah.
And then, we've used the expression, therefore, act your way to new forms of thinking rather than think your way to new forms of acting.
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
It's not that they are mutually exclusive.
That's right.
Because your thoughts have to shift in order for you to sustain habit change.
Yes.
But, so my understanding from what I've heard is that, but ACT is more, focus more on changing your behaviours and trust that the thinking and the feelings will follow the changes in behaviour rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that's right. With a few kind of, minor kind of tweaks, along the lines of, Don't ignore what you're thinking, like so to speak, and don't ignore what you're feeling, but try to put some distance between you as a person and your thoughts and your feelings. So just don't go like, for example, I'm angry. You go, I think I'm feeling angry. Don't think, don't just think I'm going to be useless in this social situation and really nervous. Instead, oh, look, I'm having the thought that I'm going to be useless in this social situation. So trying to put some distance between your thoughts and your feelings and who you are. So you kind of take the view of a kind of observer, a detached observer as to what you're thinking and what you're feeling. And you've done the hard work already, and this gets back to the action. You've done the hard work already, much like we've talked about. This pertains a lot to the stuff we did maybe in season 1, and maybe we touched on this season 2 about identifying your greater yes, working out what they say like your values are. So where do you want to go? What are your, realistic, long-term, intentional, thought-out values, and let that guide your behaviour. So if this behaviour is going to be useful to further reach that value, then engage in it and do the hard work of having that sorted out beforehand. So you can be thinking all this kind of stuff. You could be even feeling all this kind of stuff. And again, you're not trying to suppress it. You're not trying to deny it. And maybe you're not even trying to change it at that particular time. You're just noticing it and letting go. But you're saving all your energy for the actual actions that are going to be consistent with your values and your greater yes.
In the case of this kind of season where we're trying to help people who feel like they've reflected on a domain of their life or an area that they want to change. They've thought about their strengths, they've thought about what works and what they can amplify or reproduce. They've also, imagined multiple paths, some wacky, weird ones, but hopefully some that are sensible and helpful, and hopefully some that are in line with their values. But the next step is, it's time to do something about it, right? So how does this model and how does your experience in this place help? What would you recommend?
I'd recommend going back to what we've covered a little bit before already. So you've identified your strengths. So immediately that's going to set you up for more chance of success than not, because your strengths are going to be, the chances are going to have less negative or unhelpful thoughts and feelings attached to them. So already you've got some built-in confidence there. So start to leverage your strengths like we've already talked about. And then when it comes to pathways, again, you've landed, and we're talking today about landing on a pathway. So you've determined, and you're going to use the criteria, I think this particular pathway is going to be helpful for me getting unstuck. And by unstuck, we're saying, we've identified, even if it's just like unspoken or implicit, a value attached to getting unstuck.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I've done that. So that's the value. So this pathway, based utilizing my strengths, is going to be helpful to act on it in order to get unstuck, which is again going to reinforce one of my values. So I've identified it as valuable. So in the moment, when it comes to actually on the brink of taking action, I guess we're advising, regardless of what you're thinking and what you're feeling, again, don't try to suppress that, but just acknowledge it. But then you need to ideally have the other thought, trust yourself. I've already thought about this. I'm going to utilize a strength. I've already done the work of identifying this particular pathway. I've made some kind of commitment to follow through with this pathway that involves some action. So I'm going to put all that stuff just aside. Hello thoughts, hello feelings, regardless of what they are. I want to go over here and do the thing. And the secret sauce will be, I think, if you actually do the thing, then you're signaling both to yourself and to perhaps an external audience that you're a person who values this thing, and more importantly, you're competent to actually act in the world in a way that's consistent with that. And once you've done that, you are sending a message to yourself that you're capable of that. So to some degree, the competence to actually take the small step is going to breed and foster more confidence. So confidence will lead, even a little bit of confidence, even just taking a small action-based step will lead to you feeling more confident. When you feel more confident, that's going to influence the way you think and you feel for next time around. So it is kind of reinforcing a virtuous cycle, like we talked about before, that link between thoughts, feelings, and actions. But again, we're concentrating on starting on the actions, which will in turn bolster your thoughts and your feelings.
In some ways, it's the theory is really helpful. I find it helpful to understand maybe some of what I've found helpful in my own life or in the lives of others I've coached. But essentially what we're saying is you may not think that, you're a capable person, and you may not feel like you're a confident person, but if you know that, let's say my situation, I want to be a public speaker, just as one example, and it's in line with my values, well, then I should pretend I'm confident and start speaking, and it might not be great, but do the thing, do the action, and keep doing it, and eventually the thoughts and feelings will follow. Is that what you're saying?
That's a great example. And I think that's a really good example of the difference, the power of going from 0 to 1 as opposed to, say, 1 to 2. So if you're the person who thinks, and again, feels like I'm not a very good public speaker, if you just do that and you've never done that, and then you do it just once, so you go from 0 to 1, that's going to have such a huge impact on how you regard yourself, what you think and feel about yourself. You know what I mean? Because you've actually done it.
So you're saying you should go for the big jump?
Yeah. Well, again, you have to make it appropriate to your particular situation.
Yeah,
right?
okay.
Yeah. So make it doable and realistic. But even if it's a small step, if it's the first step you've taken in that direction, so you're going from 0 to 1, it's huge. It's huge. And again, to that example, suddenly if you get up the front and maybe like you think you did like a pretty average job, but even if you think that and you feel a little bit let down because of that, chances are, and I'm sure this is played out in your experience, you're going to have at least one person who comes up to you afterwards or sends you an email or sends you the text and says, listen, that was really good, man. I'm really impressed by what you did. And so suddenly, instead of just relying on what's going on inside your head and your heart, so to speak, so thoughts and feelings, all that's purely internal, I think this, I feel this, you've got someone from the outside of you, telling you something about your identity and who you are, which is going to be kind of harder to argue with than, again, your own subjective inner dialogue.
Because you won't get that feedback unless you actually step out and do something. So, I mean, the simplest thing is if you feel like you're stuck and you've been thinking about it for a long, long time, and you've been thinking about ruminating or thinking about alternatives or imagining the person you could be, none of that really counts until it actually leads to you doing something, right? Yeah. I mean, it's part of the process. But what we're saying is there comes a point in the process where you just have to step on stage, or even if it's not step on stage, to write the first talk or to put yourself out there to practice talking in front of 1 or 2 people. Like, you've got to do something. And then by doing something, you'll get the feedback, and the feedback will help shift your identity, it'll increase your confidence, and then you do the next thing. So, I mean, I think that's simple, but I just think it's really helpful, the idea that actually, I don't know, I love as a productivity guy, the question, what's the next action? And it's almost a mantra in my life, what is the next action? Whenever I'm stuck, whenever I have a project, whenever I feel like I'm caught up in something, what would be the very next step I should do to help me move forward? And by taking that next step, I learn something. And by learning something, I get the information and the confidence I need to do the next step again, even if it didn't work what I did the first time.
Yeah, that's right. Just to pick up quickly on something that you said there, it is simple, but like we've said many times in this podcast, it's simple, but it's not easy. 2 things that make it a little bit more not complex, but kind of hard to often execute, is that on one level we know that just because we think something and we feel something doesn't mean that it's true. But on a kind of lived level, so many of us go through our days thinking, well, if I thought it, it must be real.
Yeah, and it's very hard to act out of line with your feelings and thinkings.
Exactly.
If you feel and think that you don't have self-worth, it's hard to act in a way that is self-loving and kind on self. I get that.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's an easy idea
to
act your way out of your thought patterns and out of your feelings. But it's a simple idea as well.
Yes, that's right. And then the second thing that makes it sometimes difficult is that we're not talking about acting for acting's sake. And we're not talking about acting just for the sake of getting some momentum, although that's a handy byproduct. We're talking about acting in such a way that has intention behind it, that's had some consideration, some contemplation behind it, and that's going to be consistent with, again, your strengths and the path that you've picked, which is going to have to line up and be aligned with your values, your kind of greater why or your yes.
Yeah, which is why we've done the thinking part of this process over the last few episodes before we get to the launch into action. Yeah, it's cool. So, it's helpful. Look, Matt, I like the quote from Ryan Halliday, who wrote, "Ego is the enemy. Talking depletes us. Talking and doing fight for the same resources." That's a very simple way of saying something similar, that actually there's a point where thinking and talking is important, but there comes a point where you just have to actually push your energy and your time and your momentum into doing something. And that's where we want people to head. So maybe we'll pause for a moment and we'll have our moment of silence. Are you someone who gets caught up in the thinking and the ruminating and the reflecting but doesn't actually do enough? Or maybe, I have met people like this, maybe you're someone who just dives into action as your habitual default, almost to avoid thinking and to avoid reflecting and feeling, in which case, potentially you need to take a step back and reflect on what are your values and who do you want to be so that your actions align with that. and therefore you can get unstuck. So wherever you're at, what does it look like for you to act your way to new forms of thinking? Have a pause and reflect. So Matt, look, this is great theory. You can act your way to new forms of thinking. Tiny habits multiply and create a compounding effect in your life. But there's nothing like a practical example. And I was listening to an interview by Osher Gunsberg, formerly known as Andrew G, radio host, has been a TV presenter.
Australian Idol guy back in the day.
Bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is he shared his story about when he was young and he was overweight, he was struggling with depression, he could hardly even get out of bed and do stuff. And the tiny, tiny change that led to him actually building confidence and being the type of person who could actually launch a career. And I think it's a great example of acting your way to new forms of thinking through tiny compounding habits. So let's have a listen.
So I had been a roadie for a couple of years, and one of the bands moved to Sydney, and then I had no job. And so I'm 19, unemployed, sitting around, getting out of bed at the crack of 10 a.m., eating Weet-Bix, watching Aerobics Oz Style like a creep. I was 8 when I was in Weight Watchers. When I was 17.
8?
Yeah. When I was 17, I was 112 kilos. Just terrible eating and compulsive eating, trying to, using eating as a way to regulate my emotions. Not a good way to do it. And I was just getting more and more disgusted with myself in that space of like, oh, I'm such a piece of shit. I should really go and do something. Oh, but every time I go for a walk, I get chub rub between my legs and it's got to do something. And so I actually tricked myself. I was like, oh no, I'll check the mail. Now, before the internet, when the mailman came, that was about as exciting as it got in your day, all right? So I'll check the mail. Now, here's my front door. My mailbox was that way. So I pulled my shoes on and I walked that way. I walked left. And there was a block around my neighborhood. It was about 600 meters long. And so I walked, maybe it took me 10 minutes, and I grabbed the mail out of the mailbox and then walked back inside. So my brain goes, yeah, we checked the mail. That was all right. That wasn't, it's not like I went for a 10-minute walk or anything. I just checked the mail. So I did that like 2 or 3 days in a row, and I felt okay, more and more okay every time. And then the next time I did it, I started going around the longer block, which is about a mile, about a K and a half. And I just did that every day for, I don't know, probably a month. I was like, I miss that thing. I want to get that thing that makes me feel good. I'll go for a walk in the sun. This is nice. I listen to shitty radio or whatever. And one day I was walking and I was like, I just had to run like a dog when it's getting close to the dog park. And it knows, here we go.
Forrest Gump sort of style.
Starts to pull your back of your car off and you're like, chill, bro, we're almost there. And then you open the dog and it's like, open the door and the dog's just out, right? So it was like that. I was like, oh, and I'm just dun, 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 dun. I'm like screaming, like, hair's back. I had really long hair at the time. I was like, oh, and I was running and I ran until my lungs were bursting and I was sweating and everything hurt. And I turned around and I'd run the distance of 2 telephone poles. I'm like, I don't know, maybe 100. I was easy over $1, right? Yeah. Easy, maybe $1.05, right? And I was like, whoa. Everything hurt. My intercostal muscles are cramping. So I walked the rest of the way. The next day, I ran another telephone pole. So I ran 3. And the day after that, I ran 4. And because when you're 19, you're essentially on what the guys who go to my gym and they're older than me and they look like I've left the house with a coat hanger still in their shirt. All right. Your testosterone levels might be a little different than mine, pal. But when you're 19, that's the kind of testosterone that you've got. Yeah. So you start putting in that kind of activity on a 19-year-old, I changed shape like within 2 months. I'd lost like 15, 20 kilos. Like crazy how much weight I lost.
Isn't it fascinating?
It's such a great lesson.
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
And such a simple story, but I love it. Hey, firstly, thanks to 2MI and the podcast, Jack Rewalt and Shane Curry. I've been on it myself, but if you're interested in checking out the whole episode, go look it up. I think it's a 2-part series.
Going to link to it in the show notes.
I'll put a link to it in the show notes. That sounds good. But yeah, what did you learn from that his wacky story about running between telegraph poles?
It was a really good reminder of how that first step requires very little motivation in the best sense. So it wasn't a grandiose goal by any stretch. It was easily accessible in terms of like he had a reason to do it, which is as in he had a small catalyst to even consider it, which is getting the mail. The environment, the track, it was all there for him, literally outside his front door. So the barrier to entry for taking that first step on every level, both motivation and environment, super small.
Yeah. And what I love, it doesn't sound like he overthought it either.
No,
he didn't do his weight power exercises, and he didn't write down the 25 options. Like, he literally said, I might walk a different way to the letterbox today.
He still had he had a value. He had a
He had
goal.
a value.
Yeah,
and he
yeah,
knew
yeah.
he was
Yes.
he knew he didn't want to sustain the pain that he had, so he wanted to try something different.
Yeah.
But I do like the idea that sometimes we can overcomplicate it and actually just do something different. Like, just walk a different way.
Yeah.
And then if it works, do it again and go further. And eventually he experienced the motivation, didn't he? Like, the energy and the actual desire, like, just to actually run.
Yeah.
Wasn't like, I'm going to run today, but it's like he felt like running.
Yeah, that was interesting.
You know, and I think that's often the case with when you do an action regularly enough. I don't know, your identity or your motivation just happens to change along the way. Your thinking just happens to change, right?
Maybe you could call it an advantage of having low, if not zip, expectations. Well, it's true, right? Because it's okay. I'm going to run when I'm ready to run, and by the sound, who knows? Because that was just a small snippet of an interview.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like here. Okay, the plan was, listen, in 3 weeks' time, I'm going to bust out of this walking business, and I'm going to run. It was more spontaneous in the moment, but he was ready for it.
But it happened because he was acting.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the thing, right?
Yeah.
So when you do actions on a regular basis, stuff happens.
Yes.
And that's the power of forging ahead with actions.
Maybe like to try to put like a neat little bow on it. It's an example of an action-based process as opposed to a goal-based process.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In that regard.
So I think if anyone's stuck in life, obviously this is an example of health. It's a great example of health. But I think, it works with anything. If I'm struggling with finances, just like put $5 aside once a week. You're not going to get out of debt with $5 a week, but maybe the habit of putting $5 out a week would teach you something and open up an opportunity you couldn't have thought of. If you're struggling in a relationship, well, let's say you've got a broken relationship, just the thought maybe of pulling out a photograph and looking at it. I think this is in his interview as well. If you listen to the full one, look at the photograph of the person you're estranged with and just think about calling them. Don't call them, but just take that first step. The point is just what small, tiny thing can you start with that will head you in the direction that you want to head in, and don't just think about it anymore.
I like that. I like it because it's so kind of counterintuitive to people like me who've been raised on the idea of big, hairy, or audacious goals. And also the idea that it's got to be like, to kind of commit fully and make sure that I actually follow through with it. I need to plaster this goal all over social media and kind of like put my public reputation on the line. In his example, I reckon he would have been understandably embarrassed to share like his first step with anyone beforehand because it seems so trivial and so small. But again, it's action and it's repeatable, consistent action.
Yeah, and that's the way to get unstuck. So Matt, let's get practical. We've done lots of theory, even up to this point in the podcast, but now it's time for people to launch into action. I like the famous quote, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. You might be looking back and thinking, gosh, if only I did that 20 years ago, but it doesn't matter because you can't change it. But what you can do is plant that seed now. So what's the action we're going to recommend listeners do this week?
We would like everyone to pick one, and this is really important, tiny, so almost insignificant habit that is going to help them in the domain they've chosen they want to get unstuck in. So something that's going to very, very gently move the needle. And so we're talking a tiny habit. Again, so the barrier to entry has got to be completely like minuscule. So it's a habit that needs to be repeatable. So something that they can do consistently over time.
And look, ideally that would, logically at least align with a value or an area they want to move to. So, obviously walking is going to help you get fit. Saving is going to help you save money.
Yeah.
A tiny habit that if you do regularly, it actually leads somewhere. or it could lead somewhere bigger.
Yeah, and thirdly, Dan, like we want it to be something that aligns with the area or domain that they've picked they want to become unstuck in. And, for bonus points, what would be great is if it ties in nicely with one of the 25 things that you identify, preferably like the most realistic, viable option out of that 25. If you can take that path that you've selected and turn that into a tiny habit, great.
That'd be perfect.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So look, that's it. I mean, it's a simple challenge, but it's a hard challenge. So I want you to take a few minutes out to work out what is one tiny change you can do on a regular basis that will potentially shift your life. Yeah, and if people need more guidance, we recommend they go to spacemakers.au/S3. For season 3, we have a habit tracker that you can kind of tick off your progress week by week or day by day. It's downloadable, it's printable as part of our broad kind of podcast guide, and there's an infographic that summarizes all these activities in a really neat, kind of easy way.
It's a cool infographic.
It's a cool infographic.
As far as infographics go,
as far as infographics
it's pretty
go.
cool, man.
So Matt, next week we are up to episode 8 of 10 of our podcast. So we're getting into the kind of the pointy end. So look, our promise, for listeners who actually listen to the episodes and actually do the activities is, well, you'll get a bit less stuck in your life. You'll get unstuck by shifting one small thing in your life, one small step at a time. So this is where we're at, right? So next week, what are we going to talk about?
We are going to be talking about perhaps one of the most powerful levers that you can pull on or lean on consistently as a habit to make sure that you've got the time in your busy lives to do the things that you want to do, to actually make the changes that you want to make. And that is called time blocking. We'll be looking at the awesome productivity and life habit of time blocking in detail.
So that sounds great, Matt. I'm looking forward to it. But until next time, make space.
Thanks for watching.